rated by Dr. Tanveer, whom you heard earlier. So, session is with Dr. Tanveer as our moderator. And so, Dr. Tanveer, before we start with the questions, I also want to tell the postgraduates. Yes, we have 10 questions which were asked by the postgraduates, and we are going to try to answer that. We can have questions later also. We'll try our best to answer questions, but also remember, a mentor is not the Google, the internet, where maybe some of the answers we may not have. We will definitely answer it if we cannot answer at a later date. We will give you a contact which you can contact us on in case we cannot answer you. Dr. Tanveer will start with questions.
Any questions in between the session, you are free to send it over the chat. We'll note it down and we can clarify it at the end of the session. And to start with, the first question we got from the speech is how to manage local anesthesia toxicity.
Yeah. So the first question is how to manage local anesthesia toxicity. So what is toxicity? All right. We are talking about a drug that is given to a patient. And if you have given over a certain maximum safe dose, then it becomes a toxicity. So who is it who will know whether this is toxicity or allergic reaction? It is only the doctor who is administering the drug. We all know that the most common local anesthetic that we use is lignocaine. And the maximum safe dose of lignocaine with adrenaline is 6.6 milligrams per kg body weight to a maximum of 500 milligrams. While without adrenaline is 4.4 milligrams per kg body weight to a maximum of 300 milligrams. So what do we mean by 500 milligrams or 300 milligrams? We know that we are using 2% lignocaine, which means 1 ml of local anesthesia will contain 20 milligrams of lignocaine. So 20 milligrams of lignocaine in 1 ml, if you have a cartridge which is 2 ml, or if you have a syringe which is 3 ml, maximum we can give 8 to 10 cartridges or syringes, maximum 11 to 12. You cannot go beyond that. If you go beyond that, you're going to the maximum limit. So what happens if you go to the maximum limit? You can have a toxicity because of lignocaine. Lignocaine per se is not sedative, but it's metabolite, no? The monoglycine, this thing, what is that? Xanthine, and it is the monoethyl glycine xanthine, I think. Xylidide. Yeah, monoethyl glycine xylidide and glycine xylidide. These metabolites of lignocaine is what is causing a depressive action. Causes a depressive action, and it is the CNS and the CVS that is depressed. So what is it that it manifests as? It has CNS depressant action and initial CNS excitability followed by CNS depression and cardiac suppression. So how do you manage that? How do you manage LA toxicity, which is manifesting like that? So who knows that it is LA toxicity? The doctor who has administered, because you are the one who has given the LA. And when do you give so much of LA? It is when you're doing a full mouth procedure, maybe a full mouth rehabilitation with implants, maybe a full mouth flap surgery, maybe a full mouth, you're doing total extraction at a sitting. So remember, when you're giving local anesthetic, you should have a count of the cartridges or the syringes of local anesthesia that you're giving. And what are the manifestations? You will find the patient getting excited earlier and then going into a depression. When you look at the cardiac depression, which means bradycardia and hypotension happening. So initial management, what do you do? When you see that emergency call is important, stop all the local anesthetic injection that you have given, secure the airway. How do you secure the airway in your clinic? You'll have to do at least a tongue thrust, tongue lift, jaw thrust, maneuver at least. Put him in the side, put him or her in the side, in a lateral position. Establish an IV line, which is very, very important, and give anticonvulsants like the benzodiazepines, diazepam, Valium, and lipid emulsion. I will be talking about lipid emulsion more further, so I'm not elaborating on it here. If you have a mild cardiac depression that you see by the help of your BP showing hypotension or your pulse showing bradycardia, then you give vasopressor drugs like ephedrine or adrenaline. You give anti-arrhythmic drugs, atropine and lipid emulsion. If it's gone into a cardiac arrest, which is indicated by a lack of pulse, which is a indicator for cardiac arrest. If it is cardiac arrest, you have to start with CPR. You will have to give lipid emulsion, and then of course you will have to shift the patient to a hospital nursing. And after the circulatory stabilization, you will have to closely monitor the patient until completely awake and consider stay in the ICU. That is how you go about managing a patient with who is going into a LA toxicity, right? And that is acute LA toxicity. If you have a chronic LA toxicity where the nerve has been irritated by the local anesthetic overdose, then, and therefore there is a neuritis or inflammation of the nerve, then you will have to determine whether it is a motor nerve function that is impaired or the sensory function. If it is motor, then rehabilitation, physiotherapy. If it is sensory, then you will have to give drugs such as pregabalin, tricyclic antidepressants, serotonin, norepinephrine, reuptake inhibitors, gabapentin, any one of them or any combination of them, depending on whether it is ineffective or whether it is responding. Or if it is still not responding, you may have to give drugs like tramadol or narcotic analgesics or opioid analgesics. And then if you still cannot manage, you may have to refer the patient to a pain specialist. So that's how you would identify toxicity. You can avoid toxicity by knowing the number of cartridges you're giving, and how you manage acute toxicity and chronic toxicity, right? So we will know whether you have got it cleared or not by the end of the session. So you're...
I think one more point to add, the toxicity is related to the body weight of the person.
Exactly.
Not the doses. And that's fine, and one of the good explanations we got. And moving to the next question, there was a question like local anesthesia allergy diagnosis management and the alternative management. That's what I think they meant. Please explain on that.
So yes, thank you, Dr. Tanveer. So what do we mean by allergy? Allergy is a hypersensitive reaction. We know that there are 4 types of hypersensitivity, from type 1 to type 4. Type 1 being the immediate hypersensitivity that needs immediate action, which is anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis, is an emergency situation, and if you have taken a case history properly, you know whether the patient is because whether it is anaphylaxis, whether it's syncope, whether it's thyroid storm, whether it's adrenal crisis, all this, the patient will collapse, unconsciousness. The only difference being in syncope, the patient will recover when the patient gets into a supine position. You do your you just put the patient in a supine position, the patient can recover. That's syncope. But in case of allergy, which is anaphylaxis, which is a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction that is mediated by IgE, which has the systems like respiratory system, which is affected 90 to 94% of the times, as reported in literature, which is followed by cutaneous manifestations like urticaria or hives. They call it hives, or itching sensation, which happens around 60 to 80% of the time, which is reported in literature. Or it could be a cardiovascular manifestation like tachycardia followed by hypotension. That could be a manifestation. Or it could be a gastrointestinal manifestation, which is reported in around 8 to 10% of the time, where you have abdominal cramps. All these are symptoms of anaphylaxis. So we should understand, is this LA allergy, and how do you understand that? If you have taken a proper history. So you know that whether the patient is hyperthyroid, is the patient on corticosteroid therapy, is the patient an apprehensive patient who's prone for syncope, or is it LA allergy? So if there is cutaneous manifestation, naturally you will know that it is allergy. If there is no cutaneous manifestation, how would you know it is anaphylaxis? It is the secretions in the bronchi, the wheeze, the crowing noise that you may hear. Those are small telltale signs which tell you that it is an allergy. So that's how you will diagnose whether it is a allergy. Other tests that you can do before you give local anesthesia for allergy is the skin patch test, the skin prick test, the intradermal test. Then there is also the there is also the intraoral challenge test. That is something I read in Malamud. The intraoral challenge test of local anesthesia is you give 0.1 ml of sterile water, you give 0.1 ml of sodium metabisulfite, you give 0.1 ml of, you give it separately and see if the patient is allergic. And then you give 0.9% of the local anesthetic and see whether it is allergic. So you know which part of, because esters, amides, okay, we all know from literature that esters are more allergenic than amides. But in amides itself, the composition of the amides, you see in literature that metabisulfite and methylparaben are the allergen agents rather than the amide. So we should understand that when we are addressing LA allergy. So what I said is, from the clinical history and clinical manifestations, you determine or you diagnose whether it is an allergy. Before giving LA, how you can diagnose is by doing a skin patch test, intradermal test, skin prick test. You can do an intraoral challenge test, LA challenge test. So you just read Malamud, you will be able to hear refer to that test. And how would you manage LA allergy? So if you have a skin reaction, which is an immediate, suddenly you give local anesthesia, you have hives, you have itching. If the patient has itching, you have to understand that this is a cutaneous manifestation of anaphylactic reaction. And the first drug that you would give in this is epinephrine 0.3 milligrams. That's 0.01 milligrams per kg body weight, or 0.3 milligrams intramuscular. Antihistamines like diphenhydramine and chlorpheniramine maleate, and observe the patient for an hour, and you can prescribe oral antihistaminic drugs for the next 3 days, because you can even have a recurrence of the same thing again. So don't just discharge the patient or send the patient off from the OP, but observe the patient and then give oral antihistamine for the next 3 days. If it is a delayed reaction, you give local anesthesia, the patient is waiting outside and slowly starts, getting the thing, or calls up the next day and says, or calls up after 2 days and says that he had some reaction, then that's a delayed kind of a reaction. That you would have to give oral histaminic, antihistamic drugs that we said earlier, and we should observe the patient and see if the patient, usually the patient will recover. What we are more worried about is the bronchospasm. If the patient is given local anesthesia and suddenly develops a bronchospasm, that is where you will. So you have to immediately see that you, access the circulation by starting an IV line, check the airway, get a patent airway, maintain the breathing, administer oxygen at 5 to 6 liters per minute. Epinephrine is the drug of choice given intramuscular. Bronchodilators like albuterol, you can give metered spray or you can give it intramuscular. And antihistaminic drugs like diphenhydramine and chlorpheniramine maleate can be given for these patients. If you have laryngeal edema, and the patient is losing consciousness or has become unconscious, again, the same protocol as we saw for bronchospasm, you would do for laryngeal edema. In addition to that, you would add corticosteroids, that is F-Corlin, hydrocortisone sodium succinate, 100 milligrams to inhibit the edema. And if needed, most probably, if you have a laryngeal edema, you will have to do a tracheostomy. A surgical airway may be required. If there is none of these signs and the patient has become unconscious and there is no other clinical history that you can relate to, the first drug of choice is epinephrine, 0.01 milligrams per kg to a max of 0.3 milligrams, 1:1000 intramuscular, administer oxygen, monitor the vital signs, and then get your emergency personnel to send them. When you give epinephrine, remember the first dose you will give, the second dose don't give unless you have a physician along with you. So that to manage, because this is epinephrine, which can cause cardiac dysrhythmias if you give it without monitoring properly, right? So that is about allergies. So any other additions, Dr. Tanvir? Can you hear me, Dr. Tanvir? I think you're muted, Dr. Tanvir.
Yeah. Dr.
Am
Tanvir,
I
you're
muted?
muted. No, you're not muted.
No, okay,
you're not muted.
Okay.
Tanvir,
Okay.
you are muted. I will unmute you.
I can't see anybody. Is there anybody, other students there or?
Yes, ma'am. All the students
Oh,
are.
we do have. Okay, okay. We do
Uh,
have students. Okay. So we finished with 2 questions. We are on the
Tanvir,
3rd
you are
question.
still muted. 1 minute, I'll try to.
These are all questions that have been asked by some of the postgraduates.
Yeah.
So I'm
Now he's
hoping that I'm
unmuted.
answering. Okay, fine.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. That was a clear, comprehensive detailing
Okay.
of all the
Okay, Dr.
reactions
Tanvir.
that we're able to get.
Okay.
Most of the questions are answered on that. So now we move on to the next question. So that is there was a question from extraoral inferior alveolar nerve block techniques and the various types of technique. So, and also the best technique. I don't know which best technique
What's
to
the meaning of that?
yes,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
each technique needs, each area needs a different technique. So
Exactly.
not for one single procedure. So can you please explain on that one, various extraoral blocks?
Yeah. So, so thank you, Dr. Tanvir. So extraoral inferior alveolar nerve block technique. We know that the extraoral inferior alveolar nerve block techniques are directed, are administered from outside. All right. So the 3 techniques that we know of is the Kantorovic's technique, the Braun technique, and the Kurt-Thoma technique. These are the 3 techniques. When your examiner asks you what are the extraoral inferior alveolar nerve block techniques, you should be able to say the Kantorovic's technique, the Braun technique, and the Kurt-Thoma technique. So what is the Kantorovic's technique and the Kurt-Thoma technique? I'll show you some pictures. Both of them are almost the same, right? It's only the landmarks that differ. In Kantorovic's technique, it is 1 to 1.5 centimeters in front of or anterior to the posterior border of ramus. You go transcutaneous from the lower border parallel to the posterior border of ramus and around 25 millimeters. You take a 27 gauge needle and you like a spinal needle, and you don't need a spinal needle, a long needle which reaches the lingula or the inferior alveolar nerve as it enters the body of the mandible. That area, and that is in the pterygomandibular space, and you deposit the solution. So it is medial to the ramus of the mandible, transcutaneous from, I'll show you the picture. In Kurt-Thoma, the landmark is the tragus of the ear to the anterior border or anterior inferior insertion of the masseter muscle. The line drawn there, and the midpoint of that line you take as a point and insert again transcutaneous from the lower border on that the line that joins that point. Okay, so that is Kurt-Thoma's technique. Braun's technique is our regular extraoral technique where you give you palpate the zygomatic arch, the midpoint of the zygomatic arch. You go below the inferior border of the zygomatic arch, go in posterior and medial, hit the lateral pterygoid plate, then bring it out in the same direction right up to the skin. Don't take it out completely. Redirect it posteriorly at 30 degrees angle and reinsert it. It will reach the foramen ovale, and that is the extraoral technique or the Braun's technique. So this is what I was talking about when I said Kantorovic's technique. Can you see that? You can see that scale there, no? 1.5 centimeter. You can see the posterior border that is marked there. Yeah, posterior border of ramus, the lower border of ramus, and you can see that scale 1.5 centimeter from the posterior border of ramus, transcutaneous from the lower border going along the medial surface of the ramus, 2.5 centimeters. That will reach the lingula, and you deposit the solution. That is Kantorovic's technique. Kurt-Thoma is similar. Kurt-Thoma, the only difference being the line will not be as drawn here. It will be a line from the tragus of the ear to the, and from here. Can you see my cursor? The tragus of the ear to the, sorry. Tragus of the ear to the anterior inferior insertion of the masseter muscle. That line, the midpoint, you go in the same direction. Okay, so that is Kurt-Thoma. This is Kantorovic's technique. This is Braun's technique. This is the technique that we have learnt. Here you go you palpate the zygomatic arch, inferior to the inferior border of zygomatic arch. You enter posterior and medial, hit the pterygoid plate, then retract it right up to that. This should be a 27 gauge spinal needle. It should be a long needle so that it can reach the pterygoid plate, and then go posteriorly. You know, after you have retracted right up to the skin, then you again redirect with a 30-degree angle and then take it posteriorly. Yeah. So here you ask me which is the best technique. Now, when you look at the inferior alveolar nerve block from the intraoral technique, you have the direct technique, you have the indirect technique, you have the Vazironi Akinosis technique, you have the Gauguet technique, you have all these techniques. Which is the best technique? A technique where you can hit bone, no? Because that gives you a landmark. I am in this place. It gives you a direction. That is the best technique. So in your intraoral technique, the direct technique is a very good technique. The Gauguet technique is very good technique because there you're hitting bone. You're hitting the medial surface of the ramus of the mandible. You're hitting the condyle, you know, the neck of the condyle. That is good. In the same way, in extraoral technique also, it is a bronze technique where you're hitting the lateral pterygoid plate and you know, wow, I am there at the lateral pterygoid plate. And then you redirect the, the needle. So actually, as nothing is best. Everything works in a very good surgeon's or a very good physician's hand, and everything seems to be best in a good physician's hand, and everything is bad in a bad physician's hand or a bad surgeon's hand. But what I'm saying is, when you have a landmark where you can hit and you can, or like a bone where you can hit and you can take it as a landmark and then redirect, that is the best technique out of these techniques. But any technique is good in any good physician's or surgeon's hand. So that's what is about the extraoral technique. Dr. Tanveer, is there anything else you want to add?
Thank you, ma'am. So, point I want to add is, in an extra, like Kurt Thomas technique, I have come across a picture where they have put a stopper.
Yes.
That you don't.
Yes, yes, Dr. Tanveer. Yes.
So the stopper.
That's very, very important. Yes, yes. Yes, sir.
Photos were excellent, ma'am, and I think
it
answers the questions. And the next question was reversal of local anesthesia.
Yes.
So it's one of the very favorite questions for examiners.
Okay, yeah. So reversal of local anesthesia. So how do you reverse the effect of local anesthesia? All right. So when do you want to reverse local anesthesia? The effect of local anesthesia, the need to reverse local anesthesia, because all these local anesthetic agents have a period of action. Like local anesthetic, if you give lignocaine, you will tell them that for in the next 2 hours, maximum 1.5 to 2 hours, you will have that anesthetic effect. These are the precautions. Your lip will be numb. You will have to take care. You don't chew on your lip. You will say all that, right? You give bupivacaine or you give a long-acting like a mepivacaine, you will say that the patient will have a duration of action for almost 3 to 4 hours, and therefore you will say you need to be careful. But when do you want to reverse local anesthesia? That is what is more important. It is in children, right? Children who cannot understand your instructions and will go and chew up their lip. There you want to reverse local anesthesia. You've given a long-acting local anesthetic for a prolonged procedure, but the action is going to be for a longer period of time. Then you want to reverse. A mentally challenged individual, you will want to reverse. A medically compromised individual who does not understand, or or an elderly individual, geriatric patients, there you will want to reverse. So how do you reverse local anesthesia? It is by the use of a drug called phentolamine mesylate. Phentolamine mesylate is actually a non-selective alpha-adrenergic receptor antagonist. What do we mean by that? You know that we have alpha-1 and alpha-2 and beta-1 and beta-2 receptors, which are all adrenergic receptors. So these receptors, since it's non-selective, it acts on all these receptors. So the alpha-2 receptors in the peripheral blood vessels, they all are inhibitory. So they will start vasodilating. So the effect, the vasoconstricting effect of the epinephrine is counteracted. So what happens is the local anesthetic gets absorbed into the circulatory system very easily and is washed away from that area that is close to the nerve. It is removed from that area because of the increased vasodilation. So that is how phentolamine mesylate is acting. And that is how your local anesthetic effect is reversed. So since it's washed out or removed very fast, the effect is reduced. The same way TENS or transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, what does it do? It increases the tissue perfusion. When you apply TENS to the area, no, it causes muscle contraction, and this muscle contraction causes the capillaries and the arterioles to dilate, and therefore the tissue perfusion is increased, and therefore the removal of the local anesthetic agent from that area is increased. Now, there is a reference there which says that if you have given half a cartridge of local anesthetic agent, you can give half or 0.2 milligrams of phenethylamine mesylate. If you give one cartridge, you can give 0.4 milligrams. If you have given 2 cartridges of local, you can give 0.8. This is just a reference that was given to me by the moderator. Yeah. So that is what is about reversal of local anesthesia. Dr. Tanveer, you want to add something?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I just have a small question on that from my side.
Yes. Yes.
The indication was to use for pediatric group when they don't want to have long local anesthesia effect. So can we use the same drug for drug toxicity or overdose whenever local anesthesia is being given like an overdose? For,
Yeah.
Can we use this drug for reversal?
Overdose. Yeah. So, you know, yeah. So you, when it is overdose, what is happening is, if you give this drug, the action may not be immediate. It may take some time, and you are having a patient with toxic reactions with cardiac, depression. So you cannot have. You may not have time to wait for the local anesthetic agent to be, removed from that area, and you may even have, an accumulation of the metabolites. That is, what I said earlier, monoethyl glycine xylidide and glycine xylidide. These are already removed from that area and is in the system, in the circulatory system, causing a sedative effect. So that may not be useful. So that is why lipid emulsion is a better option for LA toxicity. Yeah.
Thank you,
Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Tanveer. Yeah.
So the next question is the management of facial palsy following local anesthesia injection.
Okay. So that is a question that has been asked, right? So why would you get low facial palsy following LA injection, and which injection will give you facial palsy? Obviously, it is inferior alveolar nerve block, because you're giving the inferior alveolar nerve block in the pterygomandibular space, right? So when you're giving it in the pterygomandibular space, if you direct the needle, that is in the intraoral technique, and you direct the needle more posteriorly, what is bounding the pterygomandibular space from the posterior is the deep part of the parotid gland. So if you have injected, that is why that landmark of that bone, hitting the bone is important. If you haven't hit bone and if you're still going to inject the solution, then you are most probably, you're not in you don't know where you are, or you're in no man's land. So it is important for you, that bony landmark is important. So if you have gone too much posterior and hit into the parotid fascia and you have deposited the local anesthetic solution, naturally you're going to have facial palsy. You're going to, because the facial nerve terminal branches are in the parotid fascia. So what do you do? So you know what you have done better than the patient. So you don't have to panic. If you panic, then the patient is going to panic more. What is important is that you are sure of what has happened. So you have to do the job of reassuring the patient. What are you going to reassure the patient? You're reassuring the patient that this is the effect of local anesthetic agent. Don't cover up. Tell them that this is the effect of the local, and the local anesthetic agent action is transient. They're going to be there for 2 to 3 hours. Resolve. Don't worry. I have it under control. And the instructions that I'm giving you, please follow it properly. What is most important is, because the patient cannot close the eye, there's going to be exposure keratitis. The conjunctiva is going to be, the cornea is going to be exposed, because the patient can't, that reflex is lost. So what will you do? You will give them an eye patch, or you will ask them to wear glasses, or you can even provide them with dark glasses so that the eye is protected. You will give you, if they are wearing lenses, you will ask them not to use those contact lenses till their palsy is, I mean, their tone is restored. And this incident has to be recorded in your patient's record, because remember, accidents like this can happen with anyone and everyone. We are not perfect. We don't have to project ourselves to the world as perfect people. It is okay to be imperfect. It is okay to make mistakes, but remember to learn from our mistakes and not to make it a common occurrence. If every second patient is going to have a facial palsy after an inferior ulnar nerve block, then you're going to lose your clientele. You're going to lose your patients. Okay, so if it happens once in a blue moon, or once in once in a one-off kind of a situation, and you've learned from it, go ahead. That's okay. So explain to them, and it is not contraindicated. Once this has happened that you cannot give local anesthesia, you can go ahead and give, but maybe you can defer it for another day. So that is what is how you would manage a facial palsy, right? And if this patient has, this is a reference that Dr. Tanveer has given me again. If this patient has come to you after 2 to 3 weeks, then there's a role of the corticosteroids, because of the it has an anti-inflammatory effect, right? You can give 1 milligram per kg for 10 to 14 days. That is recommended with gradual tapering. And you can also give a nerve regenerative drugs such as methacobalamine or B1, B6, and B12. But if it has happened, if it is continuing for more than 3 to 4 weeks, more than a month, then even that may not help. The steroid therapy also may not help. So then you may need to ask, a neurophysician to intervene, and you may have to think of further, which is very, very rare. With an injection, it's very, very rare for you to have a permanent damage to the facial nerve. Very rare for that. Yeah, Dr. Tanveer, you want to add
Okay,
something?
ma'am. Almost explained, ma'am. We can move to the next question. So the next question is like, how do you calculate the maximum dose of with renal and cardiac problems?
Okay. So
Maximum
with
dose of local anesthesia.
local anesthesia, yeah. So local anesthetic agents, that the agent that we're using, that is lignocaine or even articaine, actually is quite safe on the cardiac muscle. Um, the thing is, if you have given lignocaine with adrenaline, and if you are going to inject it inadvertently or accidentally intravascularly, and if you're going to inject it at a rapid speed, that is when you're going to have a problem. So how do you avoid it? Always make it a point to aspirate before you deposit. That is important. Always remember, actually, according to Malamed, the rate at which you should deposit local anesthesia is 1 ml per minute. You may think that's easy, but if you actually look at it, we deposit 1 ml of solution, I think, within a few seconds. What do you say, Dr. Tanveer? I think I do that within 10 to 20 seconds and push the 1 ml. So what Malamed has said is 1 ml for 1 minute. So if you take these precautions, the chances of causing a problem even in cardiac patients is not there at all. It is safe. That is why we use left, right, and center lignocaine, right, with adrenaline. I'm sure plain lignocaine is used very rarely. So where do you use plain lignocaine? When you have a patient who gives a history of hyperthyroidism, you have a patient with a blood pressure which is systolic blood pressure above 200 millimeters, or a diastolic pressure of more than 115 millimeters. You have a patient whose pulse is very tachycardic. You have a patient who gives you a history of myocardial infarction within the last 6 months. You have a patient who gives a history of having undergone coronary artery bypass graft within the last 6 months. These are the kind of patients where you would think of using plain lignocaine rather than lignocaine with adrenaline. Now, if you're using lignocaine with adrenaline in such patients, then what you would do is you would limit the number. You will aspirate, you will give it slowly, and you would limit the number of cartridges that you use. You would use, if it is 1:100,000. So if it is adrenaline that we're talking about, no? So 1:1,000 means what? It is 1 gram of adrenaline in 1 ml of solution. Okay, 1 gram. So 1:100,000 will be how much? It will be 0.01 milligram of adrenaline in 1 ml of solution. 1:100. Usually we use 1:100,000. We don't use 1:50,000. We may use 1:200,000. So a maximum of 0.04 milligrams or 40 micrograms can be given for a patient with a cardiac problem, which means we can give approximately 2 cartridges of lignocaine, 2% lignocaine with 1:100,000 epinephrine in a patient with a cardiac problem. Renal problem, the main thing is excretion, renal excretion. Renal excretion, when you look into the Corson and Scully management of medically compromised patient, Crispy and Scully, what they say is lignocaine is a safe drug that can be given in patients with renal. Actually, local anesthetics can be avoided as far as possible in patients with renal dialysis or renal failure, but lignocaine is relatively safe compared to other drugs like procaine. So you would limit, again there, you would limit the number of cartridges that you would use at a particular appointment in renal failure patients. Dr. Tanvir?
So in renal case also, we'll be using the same 2 cartridges, right?
Renal failure, the number of, I couldn't find the exact number in any literature, Dr. Tanvir, but they say that lignocaine is safe. You need to limit the number of cartridges. So I don't know exact number. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll go to the next one. So the 7th question was like the use of vasoconstrictors in patients with cardiac issues.
Yeah,
What is
I
the
think, yeah,
use?
I think that is again the same thing that we said earlier. Because of the arrhythmias that are caused, we are more worried about the epinephrine, right? So I said earlier, which are the conditions where you don't avoid lignocaine with adrenaline, and again, less than 4 ampules of lignocaine with adrenaline, 1:100,000 is what you would use for cardiovascular compromised patients. That's what is saying. And I think I already have explained about adrenaline.
Moving to the next question. Which local anesthesia is better in the case of abscess in infection?
Yeah. So what is this deal about abscess and infection and inflammation? No? We all know that the tissue pH is 7.4. Now, when there is an abscess or an infection or an inflammation, what happens to the pH? The pH decreases. Why? Because of the amount of hydrogen ions that is there in the inflammatory environment. All right. So what happens when when normally at 7.4, when you give local anesthetic agent, you know that this lignocaine has a lipophilic aromatic ring and a hydrophilic component. Why do you have both these components? The hydrophilic component of the lignocaine is for it to diffuse through the intracellular tissue and reach the nerve. The lipophilic component is for it to go through the nerve membrane and reach the axon, so that it causes a blockade of the nerve conduction. That is what is known about lignocaine and the environment, tissue environment. Now, when there is an abscess or when there is an inflammation, there is a decrease in the pH. So what happens? The dissociation of this molecule into a free base and cations is altered. So the dissociation constant, that is a pKa, is affected. So the pKa is directly proportional to the pH. If your pH is reduced, your dissociation constant also is reduced. So naturally, the diffusion of the La molecule to the nerve membrane is decreased. Once it reaches the nerve membrane, the hydrogen ions, the nerve membrane is not permeable. So the hydrogen ions do not go into the nerve. So there it is not, but it does not even reach the nerve membrane because your dissociation constant is reduced. All right. And according to literature, what it is said is among the local anesthetic agent, mepivacaine has a pKa which is 7.6, which is somewhere close to the tissue PK pH of 7.4. Okay, so the dissociation constant is actually quite good. So the best local anesthetic among all local anesthetic in abscess or in an abscess or a inflammation condition is mepivacaine. Also, if you use pure plain local anesthetic, because when you add adrenaline, the pH is supposed to reduce. The pH of lignocaine with adrenaline is lower, 3 to 5, I think, and plain lignocaine is much higher, around 6 to 5.5 to 6, I think. So if you use plain lignocaine, that has a better anesthetic effect than lignocaine with epinephrine, because the acidic pH. Another thing that you can do is buffering of the local anesthetic agent with sodium bicarbonate. That also helps in inflammatory condition. So anything else, Dr. Tanvir? So 3 points.
Yes.
Yeah.
The buffering of the solution as well as the use of plain anesthetic has been the school of thought for all these days. So
Yes.
that's true. But the truth still holds good. And we'll be seeing the next question. So in between, I have 2 questions from the chat. We'll see at the end of this session. So the next question is articaine versus lignocaine for inferior nerve block. What is the role of these 2 drugs?
I don't know whether articaine versus lignocaine in inferior alveolar nerve block has any. I guess there are a lot of studies in inferior alveolar nerve block, but any block, articaine and lignocaine are amide local anesthetic agents, but articaine seems to have a more protein binding influence, and therefore its potency is more, its onset of action is more, its duration of action is more. Potency, as per literature, is 1.5 times more than that of lignocaine, and procaine and 1.9 times more than procaine. So that is in terms of cardiac safety, both are equal. Articaine and lignocaine are equal. So whether it's inferior alveolar nerve block or posterior superior alveolar or any of the maxillary, any of the blocks, lignocaine and articaine, when you compare, both are safe, both are cardiac safe, and articaine has is reported to have a more potency than lignocaine. That is all that I can say.
We can think of potency now.
Yeah.
I think we have when comparing these 2 drugs. So the next question is probably I think this is the last question. So systemic complication of local anesthesia, which appears first in CVS or CNS. If CVS, which is the clinically first recognized sign. Same in CNS, which is the first recognized sign. Please explain. Many books confuse between CNS and CVS.
Okay. Right. So, when you give local anesthesia and when there is a toxicity, I think that you're talking about as a complication. Yeah. So the first sign, be very clear, the first sign that you will see is a CNS sign. All right. Because as I will tell you, I will show you the scale. As the concentration increases, it is the first you know that there are 2 signals going to the cerebral cortex, the excitatory and the depressive. So the first thing that the local anesthetic does is it depresses the depressive signals that go. So that's why initially the patient is a little agitated, the patient is a little excited. All that happens first. So that is the first signs that the patient gets more talkative. All that is what happens, initially. Then slowly, when both these signals to the brain, the cortex is, that is the excitatory and facilitate and depressed signals are suppressed or depressed, then you have it can go into from this excitatory phase, it goes into a tonic clonic phase, and then it goes into a depressive stage. That is how CNS goes. CVS, you may have myocardial depression earlier, that is, you may have minor tachycardia earlier, and then going on to a depressive stage, and your pulse rate starts become bradycardic. So when you look at this table, you see that when it is 0.5 to 4 milligrams, micrograms, sorry, 0.5 to 4 micrograms per ml, you will have the first signs of the CNS. Okay, so when you have when the blood level goes to 4.5 to 7 micrograms per ml, you will have CNS excitation, and when you have 5 to 10 micrograms, that is when you will have myocardial depression that is happening. So the first sign is the CNS sign, right? And then comes the CVS sign. Sorry.
The
Anything
next
else,
question.
doctor? Yeah. Yeah. Next question.
That's complete, man. The next question will be on the reversal agent of local anesthesia is controlled in Nestle. Antidote is lipid emulsion. In case of toxicity, how could a lipid emulsion be used in the management? Its dose, routine, mechanism, and please explain on that.
Okay. So we have understood how phentylamine mesylate acts. Okay, we know that it is an anti-adrenergic or antagonist to the adrenergic receptors. Okay, now what you want to know is, how does lipid emulsion act? Because we spoke about the LA toxicity, and the standard of treatment is lipid emulsion. How does it act? So first of all, we give it intravenous. Okay, we give it intravenous, and it is not we actually, it is the anesthetist who will give it. It is given intravenous, and the protocol is we give 1 to 1.5 ml per kg of 20% of intralipid emulsion. It is administered over 1 minute. Okay, and following that bolus of administration, you give an infusion of 0.25 to 0.5 ml per kg per minute until there is a hemodynamic stability. All right. In adults, the maximum dose that can be given is 12.5 ml per kg of 20% of intralipid emulsion over 24 hours. Children, 15 ml per kg over 24 hours. So what you need to know is lipid emulsion is given where? For LA toxicity. How? Intravenous. How do you give the first bolus? 1 to 1.5 ml per kg of how much? 20% of intralipid. After that, you give an infusion. Maximum dose for adults 12.5 ml per kg, children 15 ml per kg. That is what you need to remember. And composition of intralipid emulsion was first put forward by Weinberg in 1998. And you don't need to remember this composition because it's just comparative, or it can change from place to place. But 1 liter may contain, if you can remember soya, if your examiner is too impressed with your way of answering and wants to ask a little more, you can even if you mention soya bean oil and purified egg phospholipid and glycerol, that's fantastic. Omega-3, this is all that is the composition of it's all the lipid emulsion contains. This is what the lipid emulsion contains. Now, what is the mechanism? How does it act? It acts, there are a lot of three theories that have been put. One is it acts as a lipid sink. Okay, so what does it do? It surrounds the lipophilic drug, which is the drug we're talking about, the local anesthetic drug. Okay, we know that there is a lipophilic aromatic ring. No, it surrounds the lipophilic drug molecule and renders it ineffective. That is one theory. That is, what is that theory? Lipid sink theory. Okay, that surrounds the lipophilic drug molecule and renders it ineffective. The second is it interrupts the fatty acid, or the transport of fatty acid to the cardiac mitochondria. It increases the ready energy source for the myocardium, and therefore improves the cardiac function. The third is the activation of the calcium channels by the intralipid emulsion. So 3 theories: lipid sink, improving cardiac function by giving ready energy, and third is activation of the calcium channels. So
that's loud and clear. So from the chat, I would like to take 2 questions. One question was a little out of the topic what we have been discussed today. So what is idiosyncrasy in management?
Yes. Okay.
Next one is why there is no subjective symptom during PSA nerve block.
Nice questions. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Dr. Tanvir. First question was, what is idiosyncratic reaction? It is just like the word. Idiosyncratic means what? You do not know the reason why there is a reaction. Okay. So in complication of local anesthesia, one is allergy, which happens when you give a little bit of local anesthesia. You don't need to give lots. You give 0.001 cc, or you do a patch test, the patient may have an anaphylactic. That is allergic reaction. The other is a toxic reaction or overdose reaction, where you know that you have given too much of the drug and the patient is having a reaction. The third is idiosyncratic. You have not, the patient does not have any history of allergies. It doesn't look like a typical allergic reaction. You have not given too much of a dose, but still the patient seems to be having certain reactions which is not related to the drug at all. Okay, so how do you manage? You manage it symptomatically. What is the symptom? You will manage it. First of all, vitals have to be monitored. BP, pulse, temperature, respiration has to be monitored, so that you know whether the patient is hemodynamically stable, or the patient is having any other symptoms, cardiovascular symptoms, because that's very important. And then whatever is the symptom, now the patient has some rashes, you will give antihistaminics. The patient has some breathing difficulty, or has some secretions, you will give again an antihistaminic, or you will give a corticosteroid. So you will just do symptomatic treatment. That is idiosyncratic reaction. The other question was, Dr. Tanvir?
Why do we don't get any subjective symptoms
In posterior superior alveolar nerve?
No.
Yeah, actually the patients asked me, the last time I had the lower tooth removed and my whole lip was numb. Now you're removing the upper tooth, I can't even feel that there is, it's not anesthetized. It is basically, the nerve innervation of the posterior superior alveolar nerve. Posterior superior alveolar nerve, supplies the teeth, the third molar, the second molar, and the first molar, except for the mesiobuccal root, and the buccal gingiva. So naturally, you will not be able to feel any sensation, unless you have also injected the infraorbital nerve block, because the infraorbital nerve supplies the inferior palpebral, lateral nasal, and superior labial. Then you will feel the numbness. Only when you have, the numbness over your skin, that you feel so profound subjective symptoms. But when it is within the mouth, it's very difficult for them to be, unless you give a greater palatine nerve block and you have a gag sensation. Even that is not felt as anesthesia. You feel a gag sensation. So it's basically to do with the innervation, area of innervation. Is that all? Is that all, Dr. Tanvir?
That's great.
We are overshooting.
Dr. Tanvir, there are a couple of more questions in the chat window.
Yes,
Dr. Jimson won't leave me.
We'll do one thing, sir. We'll just forward it to the madam, and we'll find
Yeah.
explaining it.
Yeah.
The one question is that they're asking about the safety of LA in pregnant and lactating patient.
Yeah. See, in pregnant and lactating, I guess you're asking whether it's teratogenic. There are no reports of it being teratogenic. It does not, cross the placental barrier. So you can give LA. But again, as with a normal patient or a ASA 1 and 2 patient, when you're giving local anesthetic, you have to remember the hemodynamic stability. You know that the patient is gravid, pregnant. So you should check the whether there are any comorbidities. You should check the BP pulse and see that you aspirate and inject slowly. That's all that you need, and position the patient in such a way that the venous return is not affected because of the gravid uterus on the inferior vena cava. Other than that, local anesthetic can be given, and even for a nursing mother, you can give local anesthetic. That is not going to affect the lactating, the nursing child. Yeah, no reports.
And then there's one more question about Fisher 1-2-3 technique. Can you highlight about Fisher 1-2-3 technique?
Yeah. So you know that in the direct technique, we go and we inject or we anesthetize the inferior alveolar nerve, then the lingual nerve, and then the buccal nerve. So that's the direct technique. Now Fisher 1-2-3 technique, what you do is, first you inject the long buccal nerve, and then you inject the lingual nerve, and last of all you inject the inferior alveolar nerve. So what you do is, you go from the same side parallel to the mandibular teeth along the anterior border of ramus. The long buccal nerve is given. Then you go to the opposite side. You inject no, I'm sorry. I've got it wrong. So Fisher, the first is you go from the opposite side, come to the anterior border of ramus, you inject into the long buccal nerve. Then you come to the same side, you go, along the medial surface of the ramus, go to the depth of 1.5 centimeters, inject, and you inject the inferior alveolar nerve, the lingual nerve. Then you come to the opposite side again and inject further, hit the bone, deposit the remaining solution, you infiltrate the inferior alveolar nerve. So it's long buccal nerve, go to the opposite side, long buccal nerve that along the ascending border of ramus, come to the same side, go deeper along the medial surface of the ramus, inject, deposit the solution for the lingual nerve, then come to the opposite side again and go further forward, further backward, hit the medial surface of the ramus and deposit the remaining solution for inferior alveolar nerve block. So it's the opposite of the direct block. I hope I'm right. It's been a long time since I read Fisher 1-2-3 technique.
We don't use it quite often, actually.
Yeah, we don't use it, and we don't read it also now. Yeah, it's too many maneuvers. Too many maneuvers. Yeah. That's why it's not being used. Yeah, in the tissue. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's another question. Patient allergic to all kind of LA. What is the alternative?
Yeah, actually, I didn't answer it there, I think. Yeah, so as I said earlier, amide is very safe. That's why we use amide type of local anesthetic all over. It is proven that metabisulfite and methylparaben are the ones that are more allergenic. So there are local anesthetic solutions without this methylparaben and metabisulfite. That is one thing. But if the patient is allergic to amide and ester, then what do you do? You can give an antihistamine. That's what they said. I've never done that. It's been 25 years of my of my practice. I have never done. Dr. Jimson, have you given
no.
Antihistamine? Yeah, but in the book it's given. Yeah, in the book it is given. You can inject antihistamines. Chlorpheniramine maleate or diphenhydramine can be injected. That's what they say. Or give conscious sedation. No, you can't work with conscious sedation alone. You can give general anesthesia. That's what I know. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I had a patient who was the father of a periodontist, and he came and told me that his dad is allergic to local. So I had to take him under GA, then extract the teeth and then fix implants.
Okay.
That is the only option that I had.
Okay. Yeah. So you could do a skin patch test, intradermal test, skin prick test to know whether it is exactly the anesthetic agent or the the preservatives or the methylparaben that is causing the allergy, and then make your decision. Yeah, correct. Can we move on because it's 9 o'clock?
Yes,
I think.
yes.
It's fun.
Yes.
Do we have time? Are everyone tired?
No.
Okay.
One more 1 hour session on GA.
Yeah, on LA. Oh my God. Is Dr. Madhulakshmi here?
Yeah, she's joined.
Okay, great. So thank you, Dr. Tanveer. That was a fantastic session with you as a moderator.
It's my pleasure.
Shall we move forward?
Yes. Welcome, Dr. Madhulakshmi, to the program. Introduced you before you could join. She's a professor and academic head at Savita Dental College. So welcome, Dr. Madhulakshmi. Over to you for the next session on GA and conscious sedation. She's still muted.
Good evening, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Hi, Dr. Madhulakshmi.
Hi, ma'am.
Hi.
So I think LA was very nice. Now with GA, we'll finally put them to sleep, I think.
Yeah, good time to go to sleep. Yeah, GA.
We'll make sure they're sedated.
Let's do that. Yeah.
I think this is a topic which is quite vague for all of us also, ma'am, even after all these procedures that we do. So even I have a couple of questions, I think, in the go.
Oh my God.
Okay,
Yeah,
so first
let's see.
putting
Let's
all
see
the
if I
questions
can.
which the PGs have asked us.
Yes.
First is, what are the necessary investigations for general anesthesia and why do we do it?
Yeah. That's a very good question. Yeah. So, you know, before we go into the investigations, what I need to for you all to understand is there is history is important. For you know, for anesthetic fitness, GA is going to be given by the anesthetist. History, and history is usually whether the patient has medical comorbidities. Is that you know, communicable disease or non-communicable disease, you know, and then they would take they would categorize the patient according to the ASA, American Society of Anesthesiologists, into grade 1 to grade 5, right? So grade 1 is normal and grade 5 is moribund patient who may not be considered for our surgeries. It's usually the type 2, the 3 and 4. Yeah, type 2 is systemic diseases, not debilitating. Type 3 is severe systemic disease, which is sorry, just a minute. Yeah. So systemic disease, which is debilitating. Type 4 is when they are so severe that they are hospitalized, and type 5 is when they are moribund. So you know, the investigations will be done accordingly. And drug history is very important, because if they are on hypoglycemic drugs, then you need to understand that hypoglycemic drugs may have to be changed to insulin when they are taken up for surgery. Yeah, or if they have to have a spinal anesthetic, then you know, the spinal anesthetics can have a sympatholytic action. You know, the sympathetic blockade can happen, which can result in a further hypoglycemia. So or if are they taking drugs which will interfere with the anesthetic drugs that are being given. So these kind of history is very important. After history, it is the examination that is more importantly the airway assessment. In airway assessment, you know, a lot of assessments. You know, you will see the mouth opening, very important. You will see the neck. Yeah, the Malampati classification is important. The Lemon is important. Yeah, the Cormack and Lahane's classification is important. I have a dog here who is you know, troubling me. That's okay. Cormack and Lahane. So then you have the 232. You know, 332 rather. The 3-finger breath. The 3-finger breath from the chin to the hyoid, and 2 from the hyoid to the thyroid. So that, and then the upper lip bite. So these are all tests to see the neck flexion and extension. So these are all tests that are done to see whether the patient can be intubated, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And then coming to the investigations. So when you come to the investigations, the ASA classification 1 will not need you know, too many investigations, but you would want to know, the surgeon and the anesthetist will want to know whether the hemoglobin grams percent is good or PCV is good. So you would not take a patient less than 10 grams. Yeah, the routine blood investigations. Now, if the patient has a comorbidity like an IHD, has a history of smoking, is an obese patient, you would want to do further investigations. Like you would want to do, you know, an ECG to see whether there are any changes. A chest X-ray may be routinely done, especially if there are smokers, to see if there are lung changes, to see the tracheal position. You know, you would want to do serum electrolytes, because sometimes if the patient is hyponatremic, the patient's recovery can be delayed after anesthesia. So you should know that. Hypokalemia, maybe the patient could have myocardial instability. So you should know that. So serum electrolytes are important. If the patient gives history of some renal comorbidities or renal you know, malfunction or renal failure, then you would do renal function tests like serum creatinine, blood urea. This would give you an idea of how the excretion of the drug will be taking place. Then if it is a diabetic, of course, you would have to do a blood sugar level, whether it is postprandial. So those kind of tests are needed. A 2D echo may not be needed on a regular basis unless the ECG is showing certain changes and you want to know the ejection factor, then you would want to do a 2D echo. So those are the investigations I think that people will, I mean, the anesthetist would want to do in terms of, before giving general anesthesia. Is there anything else? Of course, communicable disease, as I said, no. If you want to do HPSAG and you want to do HIV, special serology is important. And now with post-COVID, I think COVID, yeah, you would have to do a COVID test also, I think. Yeah, that will definitely become a routine, I think. Once the spot tests become sensitive and specific, you would do a COVID test, I think. Yeah, yeah. So I think, is that okay?
Yes, ma'am. And then maybe for special patients like cleft children, maybe we'll have to do an echo to rule out syndrome. So these are the special scenarios that we'll have to do in our field. If we have to.
Very true. Very true.
Yes, ma'am. I think we can move into the next one. So the next question they've asked is, what are the intubation techniques in a patient with restricted mouth opening?
Excellent. Yeah, so this is an area. This is why anesthetists are not our very good friends, because both of us share the same space, no?
Yes.
Yeah. So restricted mouth opening, many cases that we see is the ankylosis cases,
cases.
tumors that. Yes, SMF cases, yes. So in these cases, what will you do when you have a difficult interview? You cannot view the vocal cords. I've seen my my anesthetist do fiber optic intubation. If fiber optic intubation is not available, then you can do a blind awake nasal intubation. If madam has put it as, if more than 2 centimeters of mouth opening is there, you can do a video laryngoscope. If you have limited, because your normal mouth opening is 35 millimeters. So if it is somewhere around 20-25 millimeters, you can even use an LMA, iGel. If you you can do retrograde intubation. That's a railroad technique. And if nothing, you do a surgical airway with the help of a cricothyroidectomy or a tracheostomy, right?
Yes, ma'am. Do you think that as MaxFac surgeons, we should be well versed with intubating the patient to an extent?
Yeah, it will be a good idea actually if we allow our PGs to have that. They go for their peripheral postings, but if they take that. Because there are maxillofacial surgeons. I know some of my friends, Dr. Lata from Astomed City, she does intubations, whenever she gets a chance. I'm sure if you have the interest, you will always learn, because anesthetists are ready to teach us. It's good to know that, I think. So we will not, we'll be more confident. It's another skill that you learn. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So next question, Shalvina.
Yes. Yeah. Can you see that, Dr.
Yes,
Madhu?
Yes, ma'am. So the next question that they've asked are the complications of general anesthesia. Mostly the intraoperative complications that we might face. And I think I should also add on, if you can tell a little bit about the immediate post-operative complications that we may anticipate also.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's put up very well by, this has all been put up by my moderators. So it's been done very well. So pre-op opioid, okay. Pre-operatively, we will start with that, no? When you are, when you're intubating, when the patient is being intubated, what are the problems that, or maybe in the induction stage, okay, when you're giving the pre-anesthetic medication, that what are the complications, or what are the problems? They're not complications really, the problems. The patient may have dryness of the mouth, because that's why you're giving pre-anesthetic medications and all that. And when you're intubating, what can happen is you can have difficulty in intubating multiple attempts, causing bleeding in the in the trachea, bleeding in the nasal passage, that can make it even more difficult. Then if they are inducing and the opioid has the dosage is too much, then having a respiratory depression. During induction, you could have hypotension. Hypotension could be because of the induction, you are inducing hypotension because of the drugs that you're giving, or it could be because of propofol or any of the inhalational drugs that you're giving, that can cause hypotension. Hypertension can be because of inadequate analgesia. You've not taken care of the pain properly, or the muscle relaxation is not properly proper, then you can have hypertension. Then during the maintenance, again you can have hypotension, hypotension because of the amount of, hello, can you hear me? Hello, 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 can you hear me?
You can proceed, ma'am. You can proceed.
Oh, okay. There's some disturbance.
Somebody is,
So
yeah.
during, okay. Intraoperatively, you can have hypotension because of surgical, blood loss, which is causing hypovolemia. You can have hypertension intraoperatively because of maybe even a full bladder that can cause, or pain, or that can cause hypertension. You can have, in your maxillofacial region, if you are doing zygomatic elevation, you're working around the the malar region, you can have an oculocardiac reflex which can cause a bradycardia and a hypotension. Post-operatively, you could have again, you could have hypotension, you could have hypothermia. Hypothermia can be because of prolonged surgeries, because of the too much of the air conditioning, cooling, especially children, you can they can go into hypothermia. So hypothermia is there. Then you have malignant hypothermia, which may not even be detected, intraoperatively, because of drugs such as choline and desflurane. So these are the things that can happen preoperatively, intraoperatively, and post. That is why it is so important for us to keep looking at the pulse oximeter to see whether the BP is okay, the pulse is okay, the oxygen saturation is okay. Keep your eyes when you're operating, lift up, look at, because even if the anesthetists are seeing, we need to be alert on changes that are happening there. So that's important. Yeah.
And if you can also tell us a little, like immediate post-op, when we go for our ward rounds as PGs, what should we see if the patient in the patient?
Actually, that's a very nice question, because I tell my PGs also, when we enter into the post-anesthetic ICU, and you see your patient from the door itself, the way the patient is lying on the bed, that will tell you whether the patient is okay or not. So what are the points that I look when I look from there is the way the leg is placed. If the leg is flaccid and outwardly, directed, I would wonder what is wrong. All right. And when I go there and look at the face and see a sick look of the face, if you have seen pictures of the Hippocratic look of a sick patient, it has the eye looks very does not have a focused eye look in the eye. The face will be pale. This will indicate that the patient is not looking very good. All right. And then your important thing is to, when you go, if the patient is not intubated, not on a ventilator, and you have recorded the BP, pulse, temperature, and respiratory rate, that's the first thing you need to look at. If all that is within normal limits, okay. So first thing is looking at the patient, the way the patient is lying down, the look on the face, that gives you an idea of this. I'm talking about immediate, the day after or that evening of surgery.
Ma'am?
Yeah, I'm coming to that. The next thing I would look under the bed and see the urine bag. So the urine bag will tell me, look at the the color of the urine. If it is straw colored, I'm okay. If it is too light, then I'm worried whether there is a increased urine output. That means the shifting, the fluid is being excreted at a rapid rate. Why? If it is concentrated, that means it is not being excreted properly. Then why is that happening? Yeah. If it is bloody, then why is there a bloody urine? So these are the things that I will look in. So we would have to have a urine output of at least 50 milliliters per hour. 40 to 50 milliliters per hour. If it is below that, that means the patient is going into shock. So you will relate BP, pulse, temperature, respiration, urine output and you will know whether the patient is okay. Sometimes you will have the BP raised, and if you just lift the sheet and look at the stomach, no, it'll be like distended. You palpate and there'll be tenderness. Yeah, and you may not have catheterized the patient. So if you catheterize and void the void the urine, the BP will go down. So that's something that you know. Temperature usually immediate postoperative will be because of the drugs that were used. It will not be because of infection. It is usually in the 3rd, 4th day that if you have a rise or spikes in temperature, that would be because of infection, right?
And for the output, ma'am, in case the patient doesn't have an output, would hot fermentation or cold fermentation help? A question raised by one of the PG.
Where hot fermentation in the abdomen, huh?
Yes, ma'am, in the abdomen. If you want to give a hot or a cold fermentation.
Yes,
Should it be a hot fermentation or a cold fermentation?
Hot fermentation will
What's
help.
the mechanism, ma'am? How does it actually help, ma'am?
Yeah, as with any hot fermentation, it just increases the tone of the muscle, I think. So the bladder goes into the sphincters, if the bladder muscles will go into contraction, I think, and then this is not something that I remember reading, but I'm just thinking that should be the reason why.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. That was very useful for all of us on a practical note. We'll move to the next question, ma'am.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Ideal drug combinations of general anesthesia. What are the drugs that we have to use while we are going to anesthetize the patient?
Yeah. So, ideal is a good word, actually, because there's no best drug combination. There's an ideal, ideal. So why we talk about ideal drug combinations? It's basically because we do not want any adverse reactions of any particular drug, right? So we can't just give nitrous oxide alone, and then because one is that if you give one particular drug, you're going to have adverse reaction of that drug. Second thing is the induction will not be smooth, and the reversal will not be smooth. So we want a smooth induction. We want the anesthetic effect for the period that the surgery has to be taking place, and you want a smooth reversal also, and you don't want any toxic effects on any of the systems of the patient. So a balanced anesthesia is what is needed. So what do we mean by balanced anesthesia? You give a pre-anesthetic medication. Why do you give pre-anesthetic medication? So that you have less amount. When you intubate, you don't want secretions, no? So you want the secretions to be reduced. You want the patient to be sedated and to be calm, so that you don't have hypertension because of fear, or you don't want, rather than hypertension, increase in BP because of fear and anxiety. So you want to relax the patient. So you will do a pre-anesthetic medication, and then during your your induction, you would want to give good analgesics, and usually during general anesthesia you would give an opioid analgesic. Fentanyl is a good option that you can give. You will give amnestic agents like benzodiazepines, like diazepam, a good muscle relaxant like scoline, non-depolarizing muscle relaxant, bercuramine, that can be given. And in addition to that, for reversal, you would want to give neostigmine, glycopyrrolate, atropine can be given in your reversal. They are anticholinergic drugs, basically. Yeah, neostigmine. The problems with that is it can cause bradycardia. That is why you would want to combine it with glycopyrrolate or atropine, right? So
the role of fentanyl, ma'am?
Yeah, fentanyl is a good analgesic, no? Fentanyl is a good analgesic. Yeah, analgesic. Yeah, so it's a combination of all this. That is called balanced anesthesia. So that is what is if you ask each anesthetist, they will say different drug. But their own choices. But it is a combination of it. That is what is an ideal, I think, general anesthetic protocol.
Yes,
that is
I think we can move to the next question then. So use of hypotensive general anesthesia. We actually see this a lot in our orthognathic surgery articles, use of hypotensive general anesthesia. Can you tell us a little about it, ma'am?
Yeah. So hypotensive, why would you want hypotensive anesthesia? Basically, so that you have a good bloodless field, right? You don't want oozing of blood from the muscle, from the bone, cut bone ends, because if it keeps oozing, one is your visibility is decreased, your surgery is going to get more prolonged, and then you're unnecessarily losing blood, so you're going to you will have to replenish the blood by either IV fluids or giving a blood transfusion. So that's why you want hypotensive anesthesia, right? But can we use hypotensive anesthesia for a long period of time? For long surgeries, especially in elderly individuals, there are reports in literature saying that hypotensive anesthesia can result in thromboembolic phenomena. So you need to be careful about that also. So hypotensive anesthesia, as I said earlier, is to decrease the intraoperative blood loss. And the mean arterial pressure that you need to maintain, or rather the anesthetist has to maintain, is between 60 to 70 millimeters of mercury. And what are the agents that are used? You can use vasodilators like nitroglycerin. You can use beta blockers like or sodium nitroprusside, or beta blockers like labetalol or metoprolol. IV anesthetic agents like propofol infusion, inhalational agents like isoflurane, or and in addition to that, you can use hemostatic agents or antifibrinolytic agents like so hypotensive anesthesia, why it is given, what is the minimum arterial pressure you need to maintain, what are the agents that you need to use, what is the disadvantage. Those are the points I want you to take off from this answer. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. I think that question is well answered.
Thank you.
So the recent trend, ma'am, what is the COVID protocol to be followed in the OT when a patient is undergoing GA?
Yeah. As surgeons, the first thing is don't enter into the OT when the patients are being intubated. Don't enter. Wait for at least minimum of 20 minutes after their patient has been intubated for you to enter into the OT, because of course that depends upon the scavenging protocol or the air purifying protocol in the efficiency in the OT. But at least for a minimum of 20 minutes, wait outside the OT after they have intubated. And when they are intubating, before all that, of course, they have taken a proper. Hello. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So the importance of taking a good questionnaire, a good case history to see whether they have any travel history, any history of fever, cough, cold. That is the most important thing. Taking a wellness form signed by them, informed consent form signed by them, saying that they are okay and they know what they are going through, and that they will not that we are absolved from them contracting COVID from the institution or from any of us. So those are the formalities that you will do. And in the OT, they say that the intubation has to be done by the most experienced anesthetist as fast as possible, with all the PPE that they use. The OT should have negative pressure. The OT can have the the HME filters. Okay, heat moisture exchange filters. HEPA filters can be used. A good laminar flow is good. With as it is written here, 20 cycles per hour of airflow. And don't use jet ventilation when you're intubating. Use minimal suction as possible. The intubation should be as fast as possible. When they are intubating and extubating, the surgeon should not be in the OT. Minimal number of people, even the surgeon, the assistant should be minimal number. So minimal number of people can be in the OT. And for, of course, using what is that? Doing fumigation after every day, I think, is good. After every patient,
sterilization protocols
have to be followed. Yeah. So that's, I think.
Yes, ma'am. That's pretty much what everyone's following nowadays also.
Yeah.
So next we move on to conscious sedation, ma'am. So what are the parameters that we need to assess for conscious sedation, and how to choose patients for the same?
Yeah. So I think conscious sedation and general anesthesia, the assessment would be the same. All right. The difference between conscious sedation and general anesthesia is, in general anesthesia, you are in complete control over the patient. The patient does not have any reflex, right? In conscious sedation, what you need to understand is this patient is dissociated, but has maintains their reflexes. That is how you need to maintain the patient. The patient has their reflexes. They will respond to you, but they'll cooperate with your procedure. That is the difference between. So ASA 1 and 2 patients can be taken for conscious sedation, because we're talking about conscious sedation procedures done even in your dental OP, dental clinic OP. So ASA 1 and 2 can be taken, and these are the patients who are anxious, not very uncooperative, but if there is a grading for uncooperativeness, the mild who can understand it's because of their anxiety that they are not cooperative, then they can be taken for conscious sedation. Usually little children, but aggressive and very uncooperative children cannot be taken for conscious sedation. That's better to be taken under general anesthesia. Painful procedures, if you do it under conscious sedation, it's very good. So patient selection is very important. Uncooperative, yes, but not uncooperative to the extent of being unreasonable. No, conscious sedation has, I have seen in my practice itself, it does not have any effect, right? So they will be uncooperative, they will be anxious. You can say, how would you assess? The assessment would be the same as for general anesthesia. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So what is the ideal technique for conscious sedation in maxillofacial scenarios? The next question.
Yeah. So technique, I think you're talking about, the way that we administer conscious sedation. So the most common, agent that is used in most of the places is your, nitrous oxide oxygen, right? At 50-50. And always remember that we don't want it going into the plane of surgical anesthesia. We want it at the plane where they are maintaining their reflexes. So the most common is the nitrous oxide oxygen 50-50. Oral, you can give benzodiazepine like diazepam. That is called actually preemptive, sedation or preemptive relaxing the patient. You can do it. It has a very good effect. The patient is very cooperative when you're doing your minor surgical procedure. If you give diazepam or a midazolam just before, half an hour before your procedure, they are very, very dissociation anesthesia. Yes. And yes, preemptive. And IV, you can give ketamine or dexmedetomidine and clonidine, alpha-2 agonists like clonidine. All these can be given. Inhalation, nitrous oxide oxygen can be given. There is a specific equipment. I think it's called Entomox or something. It is used for administering for conscious sedation. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. There are a few questions that's also coming up, ma'am. I think we'll quickly finish what's there and then you can take that, ma'am. We'll move to the next question.
Yeah.
So the complications and intra-procedural monitoring of patients under conscious sedation, how is it different from general anesthesia monitoring and here, ma'am?
Yeah. So, conscious sedation, what I'm reiterating again is, in conscious sedation, the patient is maintaining is arousable and is maintaining their reflex. That is what you should always remember. You cannot have the patient losing, because they should be able to, that's why you should be asking questions in between, because you cannot lose the patient completely, because in general anesthesia, you have the control over the airway because the tube is inside, right? So you can do whatever you want and you are sure that you can retrieve the patient because the tube you have a patent airway. But in conscious sedation, you don't have a patent airway. So you should keep the patient in the stage where the patient is arousable and the patient has his or her reflex. It's actually a very safe procedure, conscious sedation, if you do it in a proper way. So you use that machine called Entomox, I think, and give it at 50-50, 50% of nitrous oxide, 50% oxygen. It seems to be a very safe. Do
you prefer the inhalational conscious sedation or the IV conscious sedation, ma'am?
What I see I don't do it, so the anesthetist does it. What I see the anesthetist preferring is the inhalational conscious sedation. But I have also worked with ketamine. It's good, but you need to monitor the patient regularly. I mean, regularly in the sense during the procedure. What is it that you monitor? You have a pulse oximeter and you monitor the pulse, BP, you watch the respiration, you keep talking to the patient. It's very difficult for the patient to go into a respiratory depression or a cardiac. It's a very safe drug. The nitrous oxide actually is the first agent that was used by us before we came into local anesthesia, no? So it's called a laughing gas, right? So
should it be maintained at 50-50, ma'am, or should it be
it can be 60-40,
70-30?
60-40, 70-30, 50-50 is the maximum. You cannot go beyond that, I would say. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think we'll go to the next one, ma'am. We already.
That's it. Yeah, it's already 9:30. Yeah.
So there are two questions, ma'am, which has been asked.
Yeah.
One, what they've asked is, what is the criteria for extubation? How do we decide that the patient is now ready to take the tube out?
Good. So, actually there is a score for that, there is a score. I actually referred somewhere for that. Criteria for a thing. I can't really remember it. Can you help me out,
Albright score, ma'am?
Sorry?
Albright score, that is to check for the amount of anesthesia. So we would know I think more it's the reflex which the anesthetist generally look for, right, ma'am? They start looking.
Yes. So what they do is, there's a score. I'm not getting it, there's a score for that. Okay. So what are the things that they look into now practically from what I have seen is they look at the reflexes. That is, they see how the, corneal reflexes. They see whether the patient can respond to, they call out to the patient, whether the patient is opening the eyes or acknowledging. Then the next thing that they see is whether the power of the muscle is. So how do they check the power of the muscle is they ask the patient to lift their head. Okay, so lift their head. They can hold the head for some time. That is a good indication for extubation. So the arousal of the patient, the awareness of the patient, and the power of the muscle is what I think. But there is an index that one has.
I think mostly they look for the scores, no, ma'am. The tidal volume, what it is. And then the respiratory rate. I think that's something that they monitor.
EtCO2 is a very important indicator.
So these are the things that they basically look at. And then they also see if the patient is kind of arousable, as you said.
Exactly. Oxygen saturation. Oxygen saturation and EtCO2 are very important indicators. Yes, indicators. Yes.
Then the next thing that they've asked is, ma'am, in case the patient is COVID positive, how long to wait to perform the procedure?
that is still we are all loaded with COVID information on COVID.
I think in case you have a trauma patient and you find out that he's COVID positive, I can't wait for him to become negative. I have to take my precautions and go ahead with the procedure. I think that's how it should be actually.
Yeah, it has to be, because I know that, we ourselves know Dr. Neelam madam is managing so many patients with COVID, and we know many other people we know that anesthetists are working with COVID positive. So COVID positive is something that we have to live with, right? So according to the AOCMF, what they have said is, if there's a trauma case with, COVID, you don't do extensive surgeries, right?
Yes.
Do extraoral incisions, give extraoral incisions, do procedures which are short, where all the, for a COVID positive, you would use an enhanced PPE, you would use a face shield, you would use you would completely, cover yourself in such a way that your conjunctiva and your nose and your mouth is not exposed to any aerosol, right? So that is what you would do, I think, and glove and shoe cover and all that. You just isolate yourself from, but it's so difficult to be operating like as a practical thing. You will hyperventilate and you may lose consciousness when you're operating. So make your surgeries as short as possible, and give extraoral incisions rather than intraoral incisions, because the viral load inside the oral cavity, especially the oropharynx and nasopharynx, is reported to be high. Yeah, reported. Information keeps changing every day, so we do not know. We take the precautions, that's all. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. And then there's one last question that they've asked, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Will there be electrolyte imbalance after general anesthesia intubation?
Yeah, there can be. There can be. That's what I said. If you, especially if it is a diabetic patient, if the patient has comorbidities like a cardiac,
I think that's why for a cancer patient we keep looking for the arterial blood gas tension, because there's going
cancer.
to be changes.
Yes. Yeah, because if you have hyponatremia, the most common is your sodium level and your potassium level. If you're going to have hyper or hypo, you're going to have a shift of fluid from intracellular to extracellular, or extracellular to intracellular to interstitial, the third compartment, and you don't want all that happening. So you definitely need to keep monitoring the ABG. Yes.
And I think surgery is nothing but we are somehow giving trauma to the patient, ma'am. So whatever electrolyte imbalance is going to happen in a trauma can happen even when you're going to do a surgery. So sodium changing, potassium changing, the muscular, everything is going to be there. So I think that should answer their question. There would be changes in electrolyte.
Yes. Yes, there will be.
After GA. More than the GA, I think it's because of the surgery also that we do.
Yes, if it's a prolonged surgery, then you would want to do that. That's why they do the ABG when it's a prolonged. When you do CA with microvascular reconstruction and it goes for 10-12 hours, you will have to repeatedly do the ABG
And then there's one last question, ma'am, about oculocardiac reflex.
Yeah. What is that?
Oculocardiac reflex, the bradycardic effect that we have when we do any surgery. So they're asking about that, ma'am. Oculocardiac reflex.
Yeah. So oculocardiac reflex is basically when exactly. Especially when you have a zygomatic fracture, zygomatico-maxillary complex fracture, and you're manipulating the zygomatic or the floor of the orbit, and you're manipulating around that area. It can happen most commonly when you're managing panfacial injuries or isolated zygomatico-maxillary complex fractures. The manipulation can trigger the vagal stimulation, which results in a bradycardia. And that how do you identify that is by looking at the the monitor, the pulse oximeter monitor, and you see that the BP is going, the pulse is going down below 60 and 50 beats per minute. Then you need to stop. Your anesthetist himself or herself will tell us the pulse is going down. If you have already told them that or they are watching you operate, inform you about the bradycardia, you will need to stop that procedure for some time, manipulation for some time, and then decide on whether you need to continue manipulating or manipulate it less. That's what I would think. Is there anything else that they expected me to answer?
Few more questions
I think
here.
there are no more questions.
No.
Sir,
there
have you received any questions, sir?
Yes. Few more questions here. Can we practice conscious sedation without an anesthetist in our clinic?
That's a lovely question, sir.
Yeah. That's why I said actually conscious sedation is a very safe procedure. If we remember to keep the patient in an arousable and a stage, and with reflexes intact, it is a very safe thing. And this, I told you, this machine, Entonox, it delivers the you regulate it at a particular, as Dr. Madhu was saying, 70-30 or 60-40. It will come only at that rate. It will not increase or decrease in any way unless you change it. So if you maintain it that way, you are. But legally, I don't know, Dr. Jimson. Legally whether it is allowed.
That is what I wanted to
intervene, I think now you are in Australia, so you should be able to also check out for pediatric practice abroad in the US, in Australia, and UK. Just the pediatric dentists who are not qualified as surgeons or anesthetists, they deliver nitrous oxide sedation. So I think nitrous oxide sedation, maybe it might not help much for our impaction. That's why we are not practicing. But otherwise, for minor cases, as you said, where patients are going to be anxious and, just to keep them comfortable in those conditions, we can use nitrous oxide sedation. And I think that should become legal for us to be using. So something can be done.
Actually, there are periodontists who give conscious sedation.
Can I comment?
Yeah, please.
Ma'am, actually, a couple of years back, there was an incident in Bangalore.
Yeah.
He lost a
I've heard of it.
Child.
Child.
After that, the Dental Council of India has come out with a order saying that you cannot give conscious sedation in a clinic. You need to attach in a medical setup, otherwise it becomes illegal. So
maybe IV sedation is a little tricky, sir. But as Reena ma'am said, this inhalational sedation is
no, they are not specific with that. They are not specific with that. So any kind of sedation is it will not stand in the court of law because the council has given a directive saying that you cannot do it.
Okay, dental council has given a directive saying.
Yes.
But, there are certain periodontists who are still conducting CME programs, courses in conscious sedation. Yeah.
I was going to say that.
I didn't know that.
None of the courses recognized by the dental council.
Okay.
Maybe I'll check and give you once. I remember seeing a program in one of the pediodontist national conference, I think, as ma'am said. So,
actually, there are courses being conducted, but as long as there is no problem, there is no problem. But when there is a problem, then you are in trouble.
Correct.
So technically, you are not supposed to do it in a private practice if you are not attached to a hospital.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And there is another question, and there are a couple of questions directed. When is the submental intubation recommended? Okay.
So submental intubation is something that was first, advocated or by a person called Henderson. Okay. When you would want to do submental intubation is in a panfacial injury where you can't do an oral intubation or a nasal intubation, then you would want to do submental intubation. But in a submental intubation, you need a good mouth opening because you first do an oral intubation. The tube comes out through the oral cavity. Then you give an incision in the submandibular region, and you get an access along the medial surface of the body of the mandible into the floor of the mouth, and then pull the tube through that passage in the submental region. So you can do it in panfacial injuries, in bimaxillary orthognathic surgical procedures because the scar is well hidden under the lower border of the mandible. So you can do submental intubation. We've done quite a few in our institution. Yeah. And that is when the anesthetists are happy to be with us, They say, oh, you can do a submental. They get scared to put the tube in through that passage. Yeah.
And to add to that, I heard Dr. Mustafa using submental intubation for orthognathic, for the maxillary procedures.
Yes, that's what I said. Yeah. Because especially maxillary procedures, where your nose flaring, all that you want to orthognathic surgery, you want to see that saying it's better that the tube is out, and so to avoid a tracheostomy, the better thing would be a submental intubation. Yes.
And what is the role of Boyle's apparatus?
Role of Boyle's apparatus, sir. What's the
question? Okay. Role of Boyle's apparatus. Well, when I was a student, I had only Boyle's apparatus around me. But now we have the workstations around. So, and now they don't use, halothane and ether and all that. Now they use sevoflurane and,
Enflurane,
all the
right.
latest, enflurane, isoflurane. These are not gases, no, they are liquid, right? So that's the advantage. So slowly getting out. Historical. Yeah.
And
Dr.
what is
Jimson is all charged, huh?
I know.
1:30 in the night. For us, it's only 10. Tell me, Dr. Jimson. Yeah, I'm happy.
And, what are the options of muscle relaxant in an asthmatic patient?
Muscle relaxant in asthmatic patients. Okay. See, asthmatic patients, they have a problem with the tracheobronchial tree. Okay. And muscle relaxant will not have any effect on the asthmatic patient. Asthmatic patients will need bronchodilators. All right. So for that, you should understand, no, that in terms of the wheeze, no, the wheeze that you get, that is very important for us to remember. You have those extrinsic muscles that are also coming into play when in asthma. That's why these asthmatics have got the mastoid muscle, the trapezius muscle. All of them are actually very prominent in asthmatic. Yes or no? So, but those are not the muscles that are causing the causing the wheeze that is seen in asthmatics. So in asthmatics, what is important is that they are given bronchodilators. And remember, in laryngospasm, when you have a laryngospasm, that happens. Laryngospasm usually happens when you're intubating, extubating, and the patient can go into a laryngo. That you will see an inspiratory wheeze. That means when you're inspiring, there is a wheeze. But in asthmatics, you have a bronchospasm where there is an expiratory wheeze. That is when they are expiring, there is a wheeze. So in that, muscle relaxant does not have a role. It is the bronchodilation that is needed.
Doing a procedure under general anesthesia for asthmatic patients is more helpful, no, ma'am, for that reason.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So muscle relaxants is going to be the same as for any other patient.
But that is not because of the asthmatic.
Yeah.
That's not
so
because of the
it's only, I think, the post-operative care, maybe for asthmatic patients, that we need to give nebulizations and things like that immediately.
Yes.
For them. It might
I think whoever asked the question may have asked it because in an asthmatic you see the extrinsic muscles, that is the the sternomastoid and the trapezius, they are all very because that's how they they breathe, for the asthmatics. So but those muscles are not going to get relaxed because of your muscle relaxant. In asthmatics, it is the bronchodilators that you like, albuterol. You can give sprays, or you can give injections of these drugs.
And a couple of more questions, ma'am. How many times a person in his lifespan can be treated under general anesthesia?
As many times as,
is there any specific number of times that a patient can be
just pray that they just pray that nobody has to be treated under general anesthesia very often, but it doesn't matter, no, Dr. Jimson, because the anesthetic agent gets excreted, so there's no number of times and all.
But is there any specific gap that you need to give before you induce between procedures?
For general anesthesia.
Yes.
For general anesthesia. That again depends on the ASA, no? If it's ASA 1, no problem. ASA 2, maybe you need to, depends on the medical comorbidities. Medical comorbidities, yes. That would.
And I think this last question, and how do you manage in case of accidental transection of a ET tube?
That you need to ask the anesthetist how they will manage. But yeah,
immediately put the
transaction.
bag mask valve until
Yes.
he's
Yeah.
able to
No.
re-intubate. I think that's supposed to be done.
Yeah, but the transaction happening at the at the I guess at the
Postpartum,
when we are
when we do
doing
the
the
nasal cut or something,
yeah,
we can
correct.
reach it,
So
ma'am.
yeah, it happens also, Dr. Singh. Yeah. So the most important thing then yeah, it has happened. So for us to identify it, because we will be operating there, so we are supposed to be telling them. The anesthetist may not even know. There's just that bubbling of the air. Even that, that tube, the tube has a sheath outside. No, that starts getting foggy. Fogged. Show you have traumatized or torn the tube. Then what I've seen them do is, if it is they do an oral intubation, and then intubation, then take it up to the vocal cords, and then do a simultaneous that's what I've seen them do. They remove it and sing, or as madam said, remove it, put a laryngeal mask or an eye gel or something like that, and then but it is a difficult situation. You can re-intubate. They have done re-intubation. Is there anything else, Dr. Madhu, that you want to add?
No, ma'am. I think that's about it. Immediately, we need to make sure that the patient is getting his oxygen needed. So however we do it immediately, give him 100% oxygen, re-intubate the patient. I think that's why, apart from looking into the patient, we also have to keep looking at the monitor once in a way. So we know we are having a stable patient there.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I think
there's one more question, ma'am, but it's more very anesthetist question. There's a PG who's asked if atracurium is to be avoided in asthmatics, and is vercuronium preferable over atracurium in asthmatic patients?
Okay. Actually, why I do not know, but vercuronium is preferred over atracurium. But why? Please read and give us a message on that. I've forgotten that.
I think I should go and ask my anesthetist. Actually,
I will
he
find
helped
out
a lot in clarifying in my doubts. So I think I should say special thanks to Navaneethan sir, my anesthetist.
Okay. I also had to go to my anesthetist to sit for this question answer session, Dr. Jimson, Dr. Kadrivel sir, who has helped me out. And I should thank Dr. Madhulakshmi for having made such beautiful answers for these questions, and Dr. Tanveer for making such a beautiful presentation of that local anesthesia session. Both of you moderated superbly, and thank you so much for supporting me, both of you and Dr. Jimson, during this session. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Madhu. Dr. Tanveer is left, or is he here?
No. Tanveer is still.
Thank you, Dr. Tanveer. It's been wonderful. What a gentleman you are. Thank you, Dr. Tanveer.
It's our pleasure,
Thank you, Dr. Jimson.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Dr. Jimson. Yes. Thank you.
We started off as a 1-hour program, and we are almost touched 2 hours now. And
I know.
Are they all awake, sir? Are people in there?
They left. I know. We don't know whether they.
No, are the participants all there awake, sir? Or
yeah. They are awake.
Okay.
And so thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful discussion, and thank you, Dr. Tanveer and Dr. Madhulakshmi. And I'd like to thank Dr. Ilavenil, who was coordinating everything. And unfortunately, she's not able to join today. Hope to see her in the next session on Friday. And Friday, I'm sure, is going to be another fantastic session. Hope it was very useful for the postgraduates. Any questions, please click on the link, and you can continue asking any questions. We are continuing this session till the 24th of June. So looking forward to seeing all on Friday, 8 o'clock. Till then, thank you very much, ma'am. You would like to say something? Oh, madam is left. Not able to log in. No, she's not able to log in. She sends a message.
The next topic, Dr. Ji.
So,
minus,
shall we
minus,
also leave, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.